This has been a running sword within the royal family for years, and the palace gets more mail on this subject than on any other subject, and they have got it for years. And may I say, I would encourage people to continue to write in, because the more people who write in is the more likely it is that the royal family will feel enabled to confront the elephant in the room.
The official birth announcement for Prince Archie Mountbatten Windsor in May 2019 contained no witness signature, despite the requirement for medical witnesses to sign off on senior royal births that has operated as the institutional protocol since the 1689 warming pan scandal. The structural significance of this absence is consequential because it places on the documentary record the operational anomaly that royal historian Hugo Vickers raised in his recent broadcast appearance, and that Lady Colin Campbell has now developed into a substantive institutional argument on the Outspoken broadcast this week. The Meghan's Mole independent commentary platform has published the comparative documentary evidence, including the equivalent royal birth announcements from Queen Elizabeth II's own children that contained the mandated witness signatures.
Set about creating what is an international scandal where people have the means, as a result of her and her husband's conduct, to question whether they have perpetrated the scam of the century.
The Sussex household's failure to produce equivalent documentation is therefore not a matter of inferred suspicion. It is a matter of documented institutional non-compliance with a protocol that has operated continuously across multiple reigns. This is the central operational reading of the Outspoken broadcast hosted by Dan Wootton with Lady Colin Campbell this week, following Vickers' appearance on the same programme the previous day. Campbell has now developed the historical context for the institutional protocol with operational precision. The warming pan scandal of 1689 produced the original requirement for witnessed royal births. The scandal involved the suspicion that a baby had been smuggled into the birth chamber in a warming pan as a substitute for a child the Queen had reportedly miscarried, with the operational purpose of producing a male Catholic heir to displace the Protestant succession. The political crisis the scandal generated produced the Glorious Revolution and the broader constitutional settlement that has defined British succession law for more than 300 years. The procedural response was the requirement that births in the immediate royal succession line be witnessed by the Home Secretary or equivalent designated official alongside the medical attendants.
Finally, here on this show, yesterday, raised the prospect that there were serious questions within the British royal family about Meghan Markle's birth.
The protocol operated continuously through the births of Queen Elizabeth II's children and was eventually adapted to require medical witnesses rather than the Home Secretary directly, on the institutional assumption that all royal wives would be operationally trustworthy enough to give birth openly, with the medical witnesses verifying what they had seen. The Campbell structural framing on this protocol is operationally direct. The institutional assumption that all royal wives would behave trustworthily was, in her reading, the framework within which the protocol was adapted from its earlier, stricter form. The adaptation took for granted that no member of the royal family would marry a woman who would behave in a manner that would render the fruit of his loins operationally suspect. Centuries of healthy skepticism and caution were therefore discarded in favour of an arrangement that presumed the operational integrity of every figure who married into the institutional succession.
Posting the birth announcement of Archie Mountbatten Windsor, not a single witness signature, which was mandatory. Even Queen Elizabeth II had to follow the rules, and she has produced the receipts of that. Now, of course, what's interesting is that Hugo Vickers is speaking in regards of his book on Queen Elizabeth II, A Personal Story.
The structural meaning of this adaptation was that the protective procedural infrastructure was substantially relaxed at the moment when, on the cumulative documentary record now available, the institutional family was about to encounter a figure whose behavioural pattern would not satisfy the assumptions the relaxation rested on. The Sussex household's documented operational pattern, including the timeline anomalies around the Archie birth and the absence of witness signatures on the official announcement, has therefore reactivated the historical question the warming pan procedural infrastructure was originally designed to prevent the Glorious Revolution settlement that the warming pan scandal directly produced, is the further structural context worth presenting because it captures the constitutional stakes of the underlying institutional question.
There was deep suspicion and deep concern, as he said, about why exactly Meghan was playing these games.
James II was deposed in 1,688 inches, substantial part because of the operational doubt the warming pan affair had introduced into the legitimacy of his presumed heir. The constitutional settlement that followed established the Protestant succession line and the parliamentary framework through which subsequent succession decisions would operate. The witness protocol for senior royal births was the procedural instrument through which the constitutional framework was operationally protected against similar future doubts. The structural meaning is that the institutional infrastructure surrounding royal births is not a matter of ceremonial preference. It is the procedural expression of the constitutional settlement that has defined British political authority for more than 3 centuries. The institution's willingness to allow the procedural infrastructure to be relaxed at the very moment when the documentary record now indicates that the relaxation produced operational vulnerability is the structural feature that Campbell identifies as the operational failure requiring institutional correction.
Entitled to an explanation as to whether the average woman is actually pregnant or simply perpetuating a hoax upon the public, I am absolutely confident that all citizens of the United Kingdom and the other realms of Charles III are entitled to the assurance, first made following the warming pan scandal, that all the most immediate heirs to the throne are entitled to their place in the line of succession.
The structural feature of Campbell's intervention that distinguishes her position from the broader royal commentary network is her professional standing as an established author and biographer. Campbell has authored substantive biographies, including the work on Diana and Charles, that placed elements of their marriage on the documentary record before mainstream royal correspondence was willing to engage with the material. She authored the biography of the Queen Mother that included the operational disclosures about the Queen Mother's reported origins through surrogacy arrangements, including the Duke of Windsor's reported framing of her as the daughter of the family cook Margaret Rodier, who he reportedly referred to as Cookie for this reason. The same biography included the framing of the late Queen and Princess Margaret as the children of artificial insemination arrangements that produced the documented references to them in certain social circles as the turkey baster babies. These framings were placed on the documentary record by Campbell with substantial operational sourcing through her own social networks in the British aristocracy. The structural meaning is that Campbell's analytical framework on royal family matters has been operationally validated across multiple cycles in which her early framings have subsequently been confirmed by the broader institutional record. The operational confirmation of Campbell's standing came through the institutional engagement she received during the late Queen's reign. The Queen herself nominated Campbell to design commemorative postage stamps for the 10 realms of which the Queen was head of state, and subsequently to design parallel stamps for the Platinum Jubilee. The nominations were operationally significant because they could not have been made by the Queen if Campbell's broader institutional standing had been operationally compromised by her earlier framings on the Queen Mother or on the broader royal family. The Queen's nomination operates as the institutional validation that Campbell's analytical work, even when it raised substantive questions about figures within the family, was conducted from a position of operational legitimacy rather than from external hostility. The structural meaning is that the framing of Campbell as a mouthpiece for the King, which the broader Royal Rota network deploys against her work, is operationally indefensible against the documentary record of her institutional standing. The Campbell rebuttal to the mouthpiece framing is structurally direct. She has accumulated her own operational position through independent networks across decades, including her American family connections, her Jamaican family connections through her birth family, and her broader international social positioning. The castle she owns operates as her own property rather than as institutional gift. The fact that she occupies positions in the British aristocracy is the product of her birth family's history rather than of institutional bestowal. The structural meaning is that the mouthpiece framing is operationally incoherent against the documentary record of how Campbell's position is constituted. The framing is deployed by the Rota network because it operates as the available defensive instrument against her substantive analytical engagement, not because it reflects the underlying operational reality. The Campbell historical pattern of unmasking that Wootton develops in the broadcast is the additional structural context worth presenting. Campbell was the figure who originally placed substantial elements of the Diana and Charles dynamic on the documentary record. She was the figure who placed the Harry and Meghan operational pattern on the documentary record before the broader royal commentary network was willing to engage with the framing. The Queen Mother surrogacy material has not been operationally confirmed at the level of institutional disclosure, but the broader pattern of Campbell's analytical accuracy across multiple decades operates as the credibility context for her current framings.
He seemed to be speaking about the concern within the British royal family and the sort of puzzlement that she is the only woman who gave birth and then subsequently went into labour later in the day. They know something's up here, don't they?
The structural meaning is that when Campbell engages with a question, her engagement carries the operational weight of an established analyst whose previous framings have been validated by subsequent documentary developments. The Buckingham Palace mailbag detail Campbell develops is the structural illustration of how widespread the underlying public concern has become. The palace receives more mail on the Sussex children's births than on any other subject. The mail volume has accumulated across years rather than emerging in a single news cycle. The structural meaning is that the question is not, in operational terms, the product of a small segment of conspiracy-minded observers. It is the product of a broad public response to the cumulative documentary pattern that the Sussex household's operational behaviour has generated. The mail volume is a credible institutional indicator because palace correspondence operates as one of the operational signals through which the institution measures public concern across specific subjects.
Yeah, because you see, Hugo can be chucked out because Hugo's position, so to speak, is entirely related to his royal connections and his social connections in this country, while of course mine aren't. I mean, if I were excluded as a part of the British establishment, I simply have the American and the Jamaican and the international to fall back on. Hugo has none of that.
The palace's failure to engage substantively with the subject reflects the institutional reluctance to confront what Campbell characterises as the elephant in the room, but the substantive concern is on the documentary record through the mail volume itself. The structural reading Campbell offers on why the palace has not engaged is consequential for understanding the current institutional configuration. The institution has historically operated through the principle of not engaging publicly with speculation about senior royal family members. The principle is operationally important for sustaining the institutional architecture because each engagement with speculation provides additional documentary material for further speculation. The structural problem with this principle is that the Sussex household's operational pattern has reached the level at which the principle's operational effects produce greater institutional damage than substantive engagement would. The longer the institution declines to engage, the more accumulated documentary anomalies build into the public record.
After you have given birth, so he's saying the announcement and the whole failure of the timeline to coordinate is he's in courtier speak. I don't know if you've read Hugo's book on
Yes.
Queen Elizabeth II. I mean, it's Hugo has a courtier's attitude and a courtier's manner and a courtier's way of conveying things.
The structural test for whether the institutional position will hold is whether the cumulative documentary record produces a substantive engagement requirement that the institutional principle cannot continue to manage. The Hugo Vickers framing that Campbell builds on operates within what she characterises as courtier speak. Vickers, as an established institutional historian with substantial royal access, cannot place direct framings of institutional concern on the public record without operational consequences for his continued access. His framings are therefore calibrated to operate at the level of measured observation, with the substantive analytical content available to readers willing to engage with the underlying meaning. Vickers' specific framing on Archie, that Meghan is the only woman who, on the available timeline, gave birth and then subsequently went into labour later in the day, is delivered in this courtier register. The framing places the anomaly on the public record without explicitly drawing the analytical conclusion that the anomaly invites. Campbell's structural framing is that the courtier register requires audiences to read between the lines to access the substantive analytical content. Her own framings, by contrast, are not subject to the same operational constraints, because her access to the institutional family is not the operational basis of her professional standing. She has independent positioning through her American, Jamaican, and international networks, and the institutional family can therefore not effectively threaten her continued operation by withdrawing access. The structural framework Campbell develops on the audience's right to verifiable assurance is consequential. The framework operates at the level of constitutional principle rather than at the level of operational speculation. The framework's core argument is that the citizens of the United Kingdom and the other realms of which Charles III is head of state are entitled to verifiable assurance that anyone who stands a reasonable chance of sitting upon those thrones must be verifiably entitled to do so.
So she does the damage, but she doesn't actually end up reaping the reward, whether it's her crazy ideas about business, such as was never.
The right is structural rather than instrumental. It does not depend on whether the particular individuals in question are operationally likely to inherit. It depends on the operational requirement that the succession line be free of structural doubt at every position. The warming pan procedural infrastructure was originally designed to provide this assurance. The relaxation of the protocol relied on the operational integrity of all figures entering the succession. The Sussex household's documented pattern has reactivated the question of the protocol was designed to prevent. The structural meaning is that the institution is now operationally obligated to provide the verifiable assurance that the cumulative documentary record has rendered uncertain. The structural pathway through which the verifiable assurance could operationally be provided is the additional element worth presenting. The institution has the operational capacity to require independent medical verification of the children's connection to the institutional family.
Anybody, Dan, who believes in law and order and due process will be concerned when somebody is effectively taking the mickey. And Meghan has been taking the mickey for years.
The Andrew and Mountbatten Windsor precedent has demonstrated that the institutional mechanism for executing title-related decisions through letters patent operates effectively when the reigning monarch determines that the circumstances require its application. The structural meaning is that the institutional infrastructure for resolving the current question exists. The application of that infrastructure depends on whether the reigning monarch determines that the circumstances require its application. Charles, on the documented record of his disposition toward family reconciliation, has not yet reached this determination. William, on the documented record of his structural firewall against Sussex reincorporation, would likely reach the determination upon his eventual succession. The structural question is therefore whether the substantive engagement will operate during Charles's reign or whether it will be reserved for William's succession.
I suspect, I could be wrong, but I know it's such a hot potato that I suspect the resolution will be down the line when Harry and those children will be removed entirely from various situations and positions.
The Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni litigation parallel Campbell develops is the additional structural context worth presenting because it illustrates the operational dynamics that Sussex-aligned legal cases tend to produce. Baldoni and the Wayfarer Studios were exonerated by Judge Lehmann in the underlying litigation. The structural meaning is that the public framing of the case as a lively victory does not match the documentary record of the judicial outcome. Campbell's professional reading places Lively in the same operational register as Meghan Markle and Amber Heard, three figures whose documented pattern of manipulative public engagement has produced significant reputational damage to figures who have been their targets. The structural feature Campbell identifies is that the public does not always read legal outcomes accurately when those outcomes operate through the technical procedural framework that ordinary public understanding does not access. Vindication, when it operates through legal channels, does not produce the public crowing of victory that the public might expect.
Are not always as realistic as you or I would be, because the public think in black and white terms, and I am not decrying their attitudes, by the way.
The vindicated party receives the technical legal outcome without the public framing that would convert the outcome into popular understanding. The Sussex household has operated effectively within this gap between technical outcomes and public framing, and the pattern is consistent across multiple cases that have been examined through the broader independent commentary network. The mainstream media curiosity gap on the Archie birth that Wootton identifies is the structural illustration of how the royal rota system has structurally failed to engage with the substantive question. Wootton, during his period at The Sun, was operationally the only mainstream journalist who consistently hammered the palace for answers about the operational anomalies surrounding the Archie birth. The royal rota correspondents did not engage.
But the public don't seem to understand, or didn't understand in their reactions, that what they thought was a disappointment because it was a settlement and Blake Lively wasn't condemned as the absolute bitch that she really is. And I mean, people say that, and I have to say I agree with it. I think the woman is...
The framing the rota deployed against Wootton during this period, and that they now deploy against Campbell and the broader independent commentary network, is the conspiracy theorist label. The structural problem with this label is that the documentary anomalies on the Archie birth are not, in operational terms, the product of conspiracy theorizing. They are the product of straightforward observation of the institutional documentary record. The missing witness signatures are documented. The timeline anomalies are documented. The vicar's framing of the birth as anomalous is now on the documentary record from one of the most senior institutional historians operating. The Rota Network's failure to engage with these documented anomalies is the structural feature that has produced the operational space within which independent commentary has consolidated. The Wootton historical position on the Sun coverage operates as the documentary marker of how early the substantive question was identified by the mainstream press. The Sun, during the relevant period, was the largest circulation tabloid in the United Kingdom and operated with the operational reach to ensure that any substantive royal family question would be addressed by the broader media ecosystem within days of publication. Wootton's coverage of the Archie birth anomalies therefore operated as the test case for whether the broader Rota network would engage substantively. The answer on the documentary record was that the network did not engage The substantive question was therefore allowed to consolidate as an independent commentary topic rather than being absorbed into the mainstream royal correspondence framework. The structural meaning is that the institutional protection extended to the Sussex household by the Rota Network was substantially complicit in the operational consolidation of the documentary record that the institution would subsequently have to confront on its own terms, without the protective filter that mainstream coverage could have provided if the Rota Network had engaged with the question while it was operationally available to address. The Wootton's structural framing on Royal Rota methodology is consequential for understanding why the independent commentary network has been operationally necessary. The Rota correspondents depend on continued institutional access for their operational viability. Their relationship with the palace is the operational basis of their professional standing. The system rewards correspondents who maintain cordial relations with the institutional press offices and who do not raise substantive questions that would jeopardize that relationship. The system produces correspondents who phone the palace multiple times per day for guidance on their framing, who exchange information among themselves about the institutional positions, and who occasionally pay disaffected servants approximately £250 for fragments of internal information. The structural meaning is that the methodology produces operational outputs calibrated for institutional comfort rather than for substantive disclosure. The independent commentary network, operating outside the Rota dependency, has the operational freedom to engage with substantive questions that the Rota correspondents cannot. The cumulative effect is that the substantive royal family analytical work has migrated from the Rota network to the independent commentary network across the past several years. The closing observation is that the Hugo Vickers framing on the Archie birth anomaly, the Lady Colin Campbell historical framework on the warming pan procedural infrastructure, the Meghan's mole documentary evidence on the missing witness signatures, the Buckingham Palace mailbag volume as an institutional indicator of public concern, and the cumulative independent commentary network's documentation of the operational anomalies are facets of the same broader structural configuration. The institutional question on the Sussex children's connection to the institutional family has now reached the level of substantive documentary engagement by sources whose professional standing operates at the highest available level. The institution has the operational capacity to resolve the question through independent verification. The question is whether the institutional disposition will permit the resolution to operate during the current reign or whether the resolution will be reserved for the next reign. The structural meaning is that the cumulative documentary record has produced an institutional obligation that the institution will eventually have to engage with, regardless of when the engagement is structured to operate. The audience reading the cumulative material can read the structural obligation accurately. The mathematics continue to work through the documentary record. The verdict is operationally available to the institution when it determines that the circumstances require its application. The pathway is open, the infrastructure exists. The decision rests with the reigning monarch at the moment. The determination is made.